My name is Aurelie Moore. I'm 38 years old, and for most of my adult life, I was known as the steady one, the reliable wife, the practical mother, the woman who could stretch a dollar, organize a calendar, and keep a household moving, even when everything else felt like it was collapsing. We lived in a quiet suburb outside Portland, the kind of place where lawns are trimmed on Saturdays and neighbors wave from their driveways. From the outside, my marriage looked resilient, almost admirable. We survived an autoimmune diagnosis that drained our savings. We survived 2 years of debt that felt heavier than the mortgage. We survived the miscarriage no one talks about anymore. But our marriage didn't survive something far less visible. Emotional neglect doesn't leave bruises. It doesn't announce itself in dramatic arguments or slammed doors. It erodes, slowly, politely, in ways that are easy to explain away. People often underestimate me. I have a soft voice. I pause before I speak. I don't interrupt. In social settings, I listen more than I contribute. That combination tends to make people assume I'm passive, that I'm content with whatever I'm given, that I don't notice what's missing. But I noticed everything. I noticed when my exhaustion became expected instead of appreciated. I noticed when my pain became inconvenient instead of concerning. I noticed when my presence became functional instead of cherished. This isn't a story about revenge. There was no dramatic confrontation in the rain, no explosive betrayal, no villain. It's a story about what happens when the hardest battles aren't visible. It's about the quiet moment you realize that surviving together isn't the same as being emotionally held. It's about discovering that resilience can sometimes disguise loneliness. And it's about the slow, almost imperceptible shift from enduring to deciding. Over the next hour, I'm going to tell you how our marriage survived illness, debt, and loss, but not emotional neglect. I'll tell you how I slowly disappeared inside a role I didn't realize I had agreed to play. And I'll tell you about the day I stopped mistaking silence for peace. There's no screaming in this story, no humiliation, just clarity. And sometimes, clarity is louder than anger. Have you ever stayed strong for so long that no one realized you were quietly breaking? Before everything shifted, before I even had language for what was happening, I was the dependable one. To my husband, Daniel, I was the strong one. He said it often, usually with admiration. I don't know how you do it, he would tell friends when they asked how we managed during my illness. I handled appointments, insurance calls, medication schedules. When the debt started stacking up after my diagnosis forced me to cut my hours, I reorganized our entire budget. I negotiated bills. I tracked every expense in my leather planner, color coded and dated. He would say, Aurelie's got it covered. And I did. To our families, I was the calm center, the one who didn't cry in front of everyone at the hospital, the one who sent updates, the one who remembered birthdays even when we couldn't afford gifts. To our children, I was a structure. Breakfast at 7:10, homework at 4:30, stories at bedtime, even when my joints ached so badly I could barely lift my arms. No one saw fragility in me, so no one looked for it. I wasn't ignored in a loud way. I wasn't dismissed outright. I was appreciated, praised even. But it was a specific kind of appreciation, the kind reserved for appliances that never malfunction. You're grateful they exist. You rely on them, but you don't ask how they're feeling. Daniel never meant to make me invisible. That's the complicated part. He worked long hours. He carried his own stress. When we lost the baby, he shut down in a way I mistook for strength. He stopped talking about it. I filled the silence because someone had to. I told myself that was a partnership. When I would try to talk about how alone I felt during my treatments, he would listen, kindly, but his eyes drifted toward solutions. You're doing great, he'd say. We're almost through this. Almost through this. Everything in our marriage became a temporary storm. We just had to survive. Illness, debt, grief. There was always an end point ahead, a future version of us who would rest. But survival mode has a cost. To Daniel, I was resilient. To others, I was composed. To myself, I was tired in a way sleep couldn't fix. I began noticing small patterns. When guests came over, he would recount our hard years like a shared war story. But he always framed me as unshakable. She never complained, he'd say proudly. I wanted to interrupt. I wanted to say, I did complain, just quietly, just to you. But I would smile instead. There's something strange about being praised for your endurance. It becomes a cage. If you are the strong one, you don't get to collapse. If you are the organized one, you don't get to forget. If you are the calm one, you don't get to rage. And over time, I realized I had become useful in very specific ways. I was the crisis manager, the scheduler, the emotional shock absorber. But I wasn't the one being emotionally held. If I had to describe how they saw me back then, I'd say this: dependable, capable, steady. What they didn't see was how often I sat at the kitchen table after everyone was asleep, staring at the soft yellow light over the sink, wondering why I felt lonelier in a house full of people than I ever had living alone. I wasn't unloved. That's what made it so confusing. I was just unseen. And invisibility, when it stretches over years, doesn't explode. It erases. If I had to pinpoint the first small cut, it wouldn't look dramatic from the outside. It was a Tuesday evening. I remember because Tuesdays were leftover nights, budget meals, quiet routines, no extra spending. I had just come back from a follow-up appointment about my autoimmune flare. The doctor had adjusted my medication again. I was exhausted in that particular way that feels chemical, not emotional. Like my body was negotiating with itself. Daniel was at the kitchen counter, scrolling through his phone when I walked in. How'd it go? He asked, not looking up. I paused. Not because the question was unkind, but because something in his tone felt procedural, like he was checking off a box. They're increasing the dosage, I said. There are some side effects we'll have to watch. He nodded. Okay, that's good. They're proactive. That was it. No follow-up. No. Are you scared? No. What does that mean for you? Just a tidy conclusion, as if my body were a project plan. I told myself he was tired. He had been working overtime that month. I knew the numbers. I managed them. His stress was real. So I swallowed the faint ache in my chest and moved on. But that night, when I was folding laundry, I realized I hadn't actually told anyone how afraid I was. Not afraid of dying. Afraid of disappearing inside a long-term condition that would slowly reduce me to logistics. A week later, it happened again. We were at a small gathering with friends. Someone asked how I was doing, and before I could answer, Daniel smiled and said, "She's a machine. Nothing keeps her down." Everyone laughed warmly. I laughed too, but it felt like something inside me flinched. A machine. It was meant as praise, strength, resilience. I understood that. But machines don't need comfort. Machines don't need to be held when the room goes quiet and the pain creeps in. Later that night, I mentioned it casually. When you said I'm a machine, I don't always feel that way. He looked genuinely confused. I was complimenting you. I know, I said quickly. It's just sometimes I don't want to be the strong one all the time. He wrapped an arm around me. You are strong. That's who you are. That's who you are. It sounded affirming. It landed like a sentence. That was the first small cut. Not a cruel word. Not neglect in the obvious sense. Just a narrowing. A subtle shift where my humanity was reduced to a trait that served everyone else. After that, I started noticing how often my emotional needs were rerouted into admiration. If I said I was overwhelmed, I was praised for managing it. If I said I was tired, I was reminded how capable I was. If I said I was sad, I was told how proud he was of my perseverance. Each response sounded positive, but none of them required him to step closer. And I didn't push harder, because technically, he wasn't doing anything wrong. That's what made it so easy for everyone, including me, to ignore. The first small cut didn't bleed. It didn't demand attention. It just marked the beginning of a quiet pattern. My vulnerability would be acknowledged, but never truly held. The thing about subtle dismissal is that it rarely announces itself as disrespect. It arrives wrapped in practicality, in stress, in not now. And because there's no raised voice, no obvious cruelty, you begin to question whether what you're feeling even counts. After that first small cut, moments started layering on top of each other. Small, almost invisible moments, individually harmless, collectively eroding. One evening, I tried to talk to Daniel about how the medication was affecting my mood. I felt foggy, detached, sometimes anxious for no clear reason. I just don't feel like myself, I said quietly while we were cleaning up after dinner. He sighed, not impatiently, but heavily. It's probably the meds. It'll stabilize. You just have to give it time. I stood there with a dish towel in my hand, nodding. I wasn't looking for a medical explanation. I was looking for reassurance, for presence, for him to say, I see that this is hard for you. Instead, it became a problem to solve, so I stopped bringing it up. Another time, when our debt felt suffocating, I suggested we sit down and talk, not about numbers, but about how it was affecting us emotionally. We're handling it, he said. Why dwell on it? Because I was drowning quietly, I wanted to say, but I didn't. Over time, I adjusted. I learned to pre-edit my feelings before they left my mouth. I measured whether they were reasonable enough to deserve space. If they sounded too soft, too abstract, too emotional, I swallowed them. I told myself this was maturity. I told myself everyone in long-term marriages goes through seasons like this. But something shifted in me during those months. I began internalizing the idea that my emotional needs were excessive, that they disrupted efficiency, that they were indulgent. The most telling moment happened on a Sunday morning. I had woken up early, joints aching, fatigue already pressing behind my eyes. Daniel was reading the news on his tablet. I sat down across from him and said, very calmly, I think I'm lonelier than I've ever been. He looked up immediately. Concern flashed across his face. Lonely? We're together all the time. I know, I said, That's not what I mean. He frowned slightly. Then what do you mean? I tried to explain. That loneliness can exist even in proximity. That being needed isn't the same as being emotionally known. He listened, he nodded, and then he said, I don't know what you want me to do differently. That sentence settled into me like sediment, not because it was hostile, but because it revealed something. He didn't see emotional presence as something active, something you choose. To him, love was provision, partnership, endurance. And in his mind, he was doing all of that. And he was. But the space between us was growing, and I started normalizing it. I told myself I was too sensitive, that I should be grateful, that he wasn't unfaithful, wasn't cruel, wasn't reckless. There were no dramatic betrayals to point to, just a gradual thinning of connection. I began speaking less about what I felt, not in protest, not strategically, just quietly. The irony is that my silence made things smoother. We argued less. Logistics flowed better. We functioned efficiently, and that efficiency began to replace intimacy. I didn't recognize it as disrespect at first, but slowly I understood. When your emotional reality is consistently minimized, not denied, just minimized, you start minimizing yourself. And once that becomes normal, it's very hard to remember what full presence used to feel like. There's a moment in every long marriage when you realize you're not just participating anymore. You're performing. I didn't notice it at first. Roles evolve gradually. They don't arrive with contracts to sign. They solidify through repetition. Daniel handled income. I handled stability. He handled external pressure. I absorbed internal strain. He solved problems. I prevented them. It looked balanced on paper, but emotionally, something had shifted. I was no longer a partner in the vulnerable sense. I had become infrastructure, the reliable one, the one who would adapt, the one who would adjust her expectations before asking anyone else to adjust theirs. I remember a family dinner when his sister joked, if the world ended, we'd all just move into Orali's house. She'd have it organized in a week. Everyone laughed. I smiled too. But inside, I wondered, if the world ended, who would organize me? That's when I started recognizing the assigned role more clearly. It wasn't malicious. No one sat down and declared it, but it was understood. Orally doesn't fall apart. Orally figures it out. Orally doesn't need much. Even Daniel began consulting me differently. Not about feelings, about strategy. Can you look over the budget again? Can you call the insurance company? Can you research the best refinancing option? He trusted my competence completely, but he stopped asking about my inner world. And the strangest part? I made it easy for him. When you consistently deliver calm, people stop checking for cracks. There was one night that clarified everything for me. We were lying in bed. The lights were off. The room was quiet in that heavy way it gets after long days. I turned toward him and said, do you ever wonder who we are now? He was silent for a moment. We're survivors, he said confidently. I swallowed. That's not what I meant. He shifted slightly. What did you mean? I mean, do you still see me? Not as the strong one, not as the organized one, just me. He didn't answer right away. Not because he didn't care, because he didn't understand the question. You're overthinking, he finally said gently. We're good. We're good. That phrase became the seal over everything. We're good meant there's no crisis. We're good meant don't complicate this. We're good meant survival is enough. And slowly, I realized something painful. I had been assigned the role of emotional adult in a marriage between two adults. If something hurt me, I contextualized it. If something felt distant, I rationalized it. If something was missing, I minimized it. Because being the reliable one meant not destabilizing the structure. I wasn't invisible because he didn't love me. I was invisible because the role I played required it. Reliable, useful, steady, invisible. And once you see the role clearly, you can't unsee it. The question becomes, do you keep performing or do you quietly step off the stage? There was no fight, no dramatic discovery, no slammed doors. The shift happened on an ordinary Thursday afternoon while I was sitting in my car in a grocery store parking lot. I had just finished a routine checkup. The doctor said my inflammation markers were slightly elevated again. Manage stress, she reminded me gently, as if stress was something you could fold neatly into a drawer. I drove to the store afterward, more out of habit than necessity. I sat there with the engine off, hands resting lightly on the steering wheel, watching people move in and out with their carts. And for the first time, I didn't feel sad. I felt clear. It's difficult to describe the difference. Sadness is heavy. It pulls you inward. But clarity is quiet and still. It doesn't argue. It doesn't accuse. It simply states facts. I replayed the last few years in my mind. Illness, debt, loss, endurance, survival. And underneath all of it, my slow emotional retreat. I asked myself one question I had been avoiding. If nothing changes, can I live like this for another 10 years? Not survive, live. The answer came without drama. No, that was the shift. Not anger, not resentment, just the absence of self-betrayal. For years, I had convinced myself that asking for more emotional presence was selfish, that being grateful for stability was enough. That other woman had it worse. But sitting in that car, I realized something fundamental. Endurance is not intimacy. Functioning is not connection. And survival is not love. I didn't blame Daniel at that moment. He hadn't transformed into someone cruel. He was consistent, predictable, responsible, but he was emotionally distant in ways that no longer felt negotiable to me. And I was complicit in maintaining that distance. I had been translating my needs into manageable sentences, shrinking them into bullet points, softening them so they wouldn't sound disruptive. That day, I stopped translating, not out loud, internally. I stopped telling myself that what I wanted was unreasonable. I wanted to be emotionally chosen, not just dependent on. I wanted someone to ask me how I was and wait through the silence until the real answer arrived. I wanted to feel seen beyond my utility. And for the first time, I allowed myself to admit that I didn't have that. The parking lot was almost empty by the time I started the car again. I didn't cry. I didn't make any decisions. I simply drove home. But something inside me had recalibrated. When Daniel asked that evening, "How was your appointment?" I answered truthfully. "Stable," I said, "but I need to reduce stress." "That's good," he replied. "We'll manage." "We'll manage." I looked at him and realized something quietly irreversible. Managing wasn't enough for me anymore. And he didn't know that the woman sitting across from him had just stopped settling for survival. After that Thursday, I didn't announce anything. There was no ultimatum, no emotional speech about unmet needs. From the outside, nothing changed. Inside, everything did. For years, my silence had been adaptive. I stayed quiet to avoid adding pressure. I stayed quiet to preserve stability. I stayed quiet because I believed that protecting the structure of our marriage was more important than protecting my inner world. But now my silence was different. It was intentional. When Daniel came home and vented about work, I listened. But I stopped overextending myself emotionally to regulate him. I didn't rush to soothe. I didn't anticipate what he needed before he asked. When he forgot to follow up on something important to me, I didn't gently remind him 3 times. I reminded him once. If it slipped again, I let it sit. Not to punish him, to observe. I wanted to see what would happen if I stopped carrying the invisible weight. At first, nothing dramatic occurred. In fact, things seemed smoother. Without my quiet bids for deeper connection, there was less tension. He mistook my calm for contentment. You seem lighter lately, he commented one evening. I am, I said truthfully, but not in the way he thought. I had stopped fighting internally to make something fit that no longer did. My silence was no longer an act of endurance. It was data collection. I paid attention to how often he initiated emotional conversations. Rarely. I noticed how frequently he interpreted my independence as strength rather than distance. I watched how comfortable he became when I stopped asking for more. That was the hardest part to accept. He wasn't resisting intimacy. He simply wasn't seeking it. And because I had always filled the emotional gaps, he had never needed to. Silence, when chosen deliberately, becomes powerful. Not loud power, not controlling power, clarifying power. I stopped explaining why I felt lonely. I stopped translating my needs into more digestible versions. I stopped trying to convince him that something intangible was missing. Instead, I began asking myself a quieter question. If he never changes, can I respect myself for staying? That question followed me everywhere. While loading the dishwasher, while balancing the budget, while lying beside him in the dark. The answer didn't come immediately, but the space around it grew louder. Daniel continued as he always had. Responsible, kind in practical ways, dependable. He paid the bills. He showed up to school events. He told people proudly how strong I was. And I listened to that word differently now. Strong. Strength had kept me silent for years. Now it was guiding me somewhere else. Silence, when rooted in fear, erases you. Silence, when rooted in clarity, reveals the truth. And the truth was slowly assembling itself in front of me, not through arguments, through absence. When people think of preparation, they imagine dramatic moves, lawyers, secret bank accounts, confrontations rehearsed in bathroom mirrors. That's not what this was. What they never noticed was how quietly I began rebuilding myself. It started with something small: time. I stopped filling every spare hour with maintenance. Instead of automatically reorganizing closets or optimizing grocery lists, I began using those fragments of time to study, not marriage advice, myself. I began journaling differently, not venting, not listing grievances, just documenting patterns, dates, conversations, my emotional responses. I wasn't building a case against Daniel. I was building clarity for myself. I wrote down every time I expressed a need and how it was received. I noted how often he asked about my inner world without prompting. I recorded how my body felt after certain conversations: tight, heavy, neutral. Data removes drama. Patterns become harder to deny when they're written in ink. At the same time, I quietly expanded my financial independence. I had always handled the books, but now I sharpened my certifications. I enrolled in an advanced bookkeeping course online. Late at night, after everyone was asleep, I completed modules. I updated my resume. I reached out to 2 former clients under the guise of seeing what's out there. Daniel noticed I was busy. Taking on more work? He asked one evening. Just staying current, I replied. He nodded approvingly. That's smart. He thought I was reinforcing our stability. I was reinforcing mine. I also started therapy again. Not crisis therapy, growth therapy. I didn't frame it as a marital emergency. I framed it as stress management, which wasn't untrue. In those sessions, I practiced something I had never truly allowed myself to do. I spoke without minimizing. I feel unseen, I said plainly. My therapist didn't reframe it, didn't solve it. She just asked, what would being seen look like? That question lingered for weeks. Being seen would look like being asked about my grief without me initiating it. It would look like my exhaustion being met with comfort, not admiration. It would look like someone noticing the quiet shift in me before I had to explain it. And I began to realize something uncomfortable. I no longer believed Daniel was capable of that level of emotional attunement. Not because he was unwilling, but because he didn't perceive the absence. You can't fix what you don't experience as broken. Meanwhile, outwardly, I remained calm, organized, reliable. But internally, I was repositioning. I updated passwords. I reviewed our assets and liabilities with fresh eyes. I calculated what independence would realistically require, not impulsively, carefully. There was no anger fueling this preparation, only responsibility to myself. The most surprising change was this. I stopped fantasizing about him changing. For years, my hope had been tethered to a future version of us, where he suddenly understood the depth of what I needed, where one perfectly articulated conversation would unlock awareness. But hope, when stretched too thin, becomes delay, and delay was no longer aligned with my clarity. They never noticed that my laughter had become measured, that my questions had become observational rather than pleading, that my planner, once filled with family logistics, now includes personal milestones and contingency plans. I wasn't plotting revenge, I was in denial. And that kind of preparation doesn't make noise, it just makes you steady. Clarity is one thing, leverage is another. I didn't go looking for it. I wasn't searching for a weakness to exploit or a secret to uncover. But when you begin paying attention, truly paying attention, you start seeing the architecture of your life differently. The private reveal didn't happen in a dramatic discovery. It happened while reviewing our finances one Saturday afternoon. Daniel trusted me completely with our accounts. I tracked expenses, filed taxes, and monitored investments. For years, I approached it with one shared goal: keep us afloat. But this time, I asked a different question. If I needed to stand on my own, could I? I ran projections quietly. What would child support realistically look like? What would spousal support look like, given the years I reduced my income for illness and childcare? What was my earning capacity now that I had updated certifications? The numbers surprised me, not because they promised luxury, but because they promised stability. I had always framed myself as the one who needed protection because of my health, the one who was financially vulnerable. But the truth was more nuanced. I understood every account, every debt, every asset. I knew our cash flow better than Daniel did. I knew where flexibility existed. Knowledge is leverage. And I had it. That realization didn't make me triumphant. It made me calm. For years, part of my silence had been rooted in fear. Subtle, unspoken fear that leaving would destabilize everything. My illness made me dependent. That survival required partnership at any cost. But the spreadsheet in front of me told a quieter truth. I wasn't trapped. I was choosing. And once you understand that you are choosing your circumstances, not stuck in them, the emotional equation changes. Around the same time, something else became clear. I stopped initiating physical closeness, not as punishment, as honesty. I realized I had been using physical proximity to compensate for emotional distance, reaching for his hand, leaning into him on the couch, initiating intimacy in hopes it would spark a connection. When I stopped initiating, I waited to see if he would. He didn't, not in a sustained way. There were occasional gestures, but nothing rooted in deeper curiosity about where I was emotionally. That absence was revealing. I remember lying in bed one night, staring at the ceiling, feeling a strange mixture of grief and empowerment. Grief for the version of us I had tried to preserve. Empowerment in knowing I didn't need to preserve it anymore. The private reveal wasn't about catching him in wrongdoing. It was about catching myself in a truth. I had the resources, the competence, and the emotional regulation to leave with dignity if I chose to. And more importantly, I had the right. That realization shifted the internal power dynamic entirely. Not because I wanted to control him, but because I no longer needed him to change in order for me to feel secure. Security was now internal, quiet, solid, undeniable. And once you reach that point, the next decision becomes less emotional and more deliberate. There's a myth about decision points. People imagine a single explosive moment, a betrayal exposed, a fight that goes too far, a line crossed so clearly that walking away feels inevitable. That wasn't my experience. The decision point came on a perfectly calm evening. We were sitting at the kitchen table, laptops open, reviewing our monthly budget. It was routine, familiar, almost comforting in its predictability. Daniel was talking about refinancing options, interest rates, long term savings. I was listening, nodding, contributing when necessary. And suddenly, I saw it. 10 years from now. Not vividly, not dramatically. Just a quiet projection of the same table, the same dynamic. Me managing, him providing, us functioning. Stable, responsible, respectful, emotionally thin. The image didn't terrify me. It exhausted me. After we closed our laptops, he leaned back in his chair and said, "We've come a long way." "We have," I agreed. And we had. We survived illness, debt, loss, stress. We had been disciplined, loyal, persistent. But survival had become our identity. That night, I lay awake and let myself consider every option without judgment. Option 1: stay exactly as we are. Accept that this is the emotional ceiling. Redirect my expectations. Find fulfillment elsewhere. Friends, work, therapy. Option 2: try again. One more deep conversation. One more attempt to articulate what I needed. Risk hearing, "I don't know what you want me to do," one more time. Option 3: choose an ending, not out of anger, but alignment. I didn't rush the answer. I imagined myself at 50, 60, looking back. Would I regret leaving a stable, decent man? Or would I regret abandoning myself slowly in order to preserve comfort? That question settled everything. Stability, without emotional reciprocity, had begun to feel like erosion. I didn't want drama. I didn't want to punish him. I didn't even want to win. I wanted congruence. I wanted my external life to match the clarity I had reached internally. And I realized something quietly irreversible. Staying would require me to shrink again. Leaving would require courage. I've always been strong. Everyone says that. But strength, I realized, is not measured by how much you can endure. It's measured by what you're willing to walk away from. The decision came not with tears, but with stillness. I would leave. Not immediately, not impulsively, but deliberately. I closed my eyes that night and felt something I hadn't felt in years. Not relief, alignment. And once a decision like that settles into your body, it doesn't fade, it waits for action. Once the decision was made, I didn't feel urgency. I felt precision. There's a difference. Urgency is emotional, it's reactive. It wants immediate change to soothe discomfort. Precision is patient. It understands that irreversible decisions deserve careful execution. I gave myself 3 months, not to test the marriage again, not to wait for a miracle shift, but to move responsibly. The first thing I did was schedule a consultation with a family law attorney during a weekday morning when Daniel was at work and the kids were at school. I framed it in my mind as information gathering, not betrayal. The lawyer was calm, direct, and unsurprised. She walked me through realistic scenarios: asset division, timelines, and custody structures. There was no sensationalism, just logistics. When she asked, "Is there abuse or infidelity?" I shook my head. "Emotional neglect," I said instead. She nodded in a way that told me she had heard that phrase many times before. I left her office not shaken but steadied. Next, I separated small streams of income. My renewed bookkeeping clients began paying into an account in my name, not secretly siphoning, just structuring my earnings clearly and independently. I updated my LinkedIn profile quietly. I refreshed professional references. I increased my work hours gradually so the shift wouldn't feel abrupt to anyone watching. At home, nothing looked different. I still managed dinner, still attended school events, still discussing refinancing options. Daniel remained unaware, not because I was deceiving him maliciously, but because he had grown accustomed to my independence. My busyness didn't alarm him. My calm didn't signal danger. Silence, when you've been known as composed for years, raises no suspicion. I also began reducing emotional dependency patterns. If I felt overwhelmed, I called a friend instead of waiting for him to notice. If I felt proud of a professional milestone, I celebrated it internally before sharing it. If I felt lonely, I acknowledged it without trying to fix it through proximity. This wasn't emotional withdrawal, it was emotional autonomy. One evening, Daniel commented, "You've been really focused lately." "I have," I said. "On what?" "Myself." He smiled lightly. "That's good." He thought I meant self-care. I meant self-determination. The most difficult part of moving in silence wasn't secrecy. It was restraint. There were moments when I wanted to tell him, to sit him down and say, "This is happening because you never saw me." But that impulse wasn't aligned with my values. I wasn't leaving to teach him a lesson. I was leaving because I had already learned mine. The paperwork began forming quietly. Timelines mapped out. Financial cushions calculated. And still, the house remained peaceful. No shouting, no accusations. Just the steady hum of a family functioning. That's the paradox of emotional neglect. From the outside, everything can look intact right up until the moment it isn't. And by the time others notice the shift, the decision has already been made internally for months. The first consequence wasn't legal. It was emotional gravity shifting in the room. When you stop over-functioning, people feel it before they understand it. I stopped anticipating Daniel's needs. I no longer reminded him about appointments unless they directly involved me. I didn't monitor his stress levels like a second nervous system. I didn't soften difficult conversations with humor. I remained kind, but I stopped compensating. At first, he didn't articulate the difference. He just seemed slightly unsettled. One evening, he came home visibly frustrated about a conflict at work. Normally, I would have set aside whatever I was doing, leaned in, asked layered questions, and helped him process. That night, I listened respectfully. That sounds frustrating, I said. He waited for more. I returned to slicing vegetables. After a moment, he said, "That's it?" I looked up. "What do you mean? You're usually more engaged." I paused carefully. "I trust you to handle it." It wasn't cold. It was sincere. But it was unfamiliar. Another consequence surfaced subtly. He began initiating small physical gestures again. Hand on my back, reaching for my hand on the couch. I noticed the timing. It wasn't driven by deeper conversation. It was driven by sensing distance. Energy withdrawal often registers before language does. One night, he asked, "Are we okay?" I held his gaze. "Yes," I said. "We're stable." He frowned slightly. "That's not what I asked." I didn't rush to reassure him. The absence of my usual immediate comfort created a vacuum he couldn't name. At the same time, practical consequences began emerging. I shifted more household responsibilities back to shared territory. If something was his task, I let it remain his task, even if it meant minor inconveniences. A missed deadline, a forgotten form. Nothing catastrophic, just natural accountability. For years, I had buffered him from the friction of daily life. Without that buffer, he began encountering small discomforts. "You didn't remind me about the insurance form," he said once. "I assumed you had it on your calendar." I replied calmly. Silence, not hostile, just unfamiliar. What he was feeling wasn't punishment. It was the absence of invisible labor. And that absence created a subtle loss. Loss of ease, loss of emotional cushioning, loss of the constant reassurance that everything would be managed quietly. He couldn't yet identify what was missing, but he could feel it. And still, he didn't ask the deeper question. He didn't sit down and say, "Are you withdrawing from me?" Because from his perspective, nothing dramatic had happened. We weren't fighting. We weren't hostile. We weren't unstable. We were simply less fused. The consequence of emotional neglect isn't an explosion, it's detachment. And detachment, when it reaches a certain threshold, doesn't announce itself. It recalibrates the relationship quietly. By the time someone senses something slipping, it has already shifted beyond easy repair. The moment he understood didn't arrive with shouting. It arrived with paperwork. I asked him to sit down with me on a Sunday afternoon. The house was quiet. The kids were at a friend's house. The light coming through the living room windows was soft, almost gentle. He looked relaxed when he sat down. "What's up?" he asked. I placed the folder on the coffee table between us. Not dramatically, just carefully. "I've made a decision," I said. There's something about that sentence that shifts oxygen in a room. His posture changed immediately. "About what?" "Our marriage." Silence. I didn't rush. I didn't cry. I didn't accuse. "I'm filing for divorce," I said evenly. The word hung there. Divorce. For a few seconds, he just stared at me, as if waiting for context that would make the sentence reversible. "Is this a joke?" he asked quietly. "No." His face didn't turn angry. It turned confused. "Where is this coming from?" "We're fine. We've been fine." There it was again. "We're fine." I folded my hands in my lap to keep them steady. "We've survived a lot," I said. "But surviving isn't the same as being emotionally connected. I've been telling you for years that I felt lonely." He shook his head. "You said you felt overwhelmed sometimes. You never said you wanted to leave." "I didn't want to leave," I replied. "I wanted to be seen." His voice rose, not shouting, but strained. "Why didn't you tell me it was this serious?" I held his eyes. "I did, just not in a way that sounded urgent." That was the part that broke something in him. Because urgency is what he responded to. Illness was urgent. Debt was urgent. Loss was urgent. Loneliness wasn't. He leaned back, running a hand through his hair. "We can fix this," he said quickly. "We can go to counseling. I can try harder." I felt the tremor in my chest, but not doubt. "I believe you would try," I said softly. "But I don't want you trying, because you're afraid of losing me. I needed you to see me before I reached this point." He looked at me then, not at the folder, not at the logistics, at me. And I saw something I hadn't seen in a long time. Panic, not anger, not resentment. Panic. "Is there someone else?" he asked. "No," I answered immediately. "This isn't about someone else. It's about me." He whispered, almost to himself. "I thought we were solid." "We were stable," I corrected gently. That distinction landed heavily. He began cycling through solutions. Therapy schedules, date nights, vacations. All the things people reach for when they realize something essential has slipped. But by the time he reached for them, I had already let go internally months ago. That's the cruel truth about delayed awareness. When one person has been grieving quietly for years, the other person experiences the ending as sudden. To him, it felt abrupt. To me, it felt overdue. And there are some realizations that come too late. Not because repair is impossible, but because the emotional departure has already happened. The days after I told him were strangely quiet. No shouting, no slammed doors, no character attacks. Just a house adjusting to a truth it hadn't anticipated. Daniel moved through the rooms like someone trying to locate a sound he couldn't quite place. He was attentive in ways he hadn't been before. He asked more questions. He lingered in doorways. He watched me, not suspiciously, worried. One evening, about a week after I told him, he asked if we could talk again. We sat at the same kitchen table where so many practical conversations had happened over the years. He didn't bring solutions this time. He brought confusion. "I don't understand how I missed it," he said quietly. I didn't rush to reassure him. "You didn't miss it," I replied. "You just interpreted it differently." He frowned. "When you said you felt lonely, I thought you meant temporarily. I thought once things settled, it would get better." "That's what I hoped too," I said. He looked down at his hands. "Why didn't you tell me you were reaching a breaking point?" I chose my words carefully, because I wasn't breaking loudly. I was thinking quietly. That sentence stayed between us for a long moment. He swallowed. "I would have done the work." "I know," I said, and I meant it. "But I needed you to see that work was required without me escalating to a crisis." There it was, the core difference. He responded to the fire. I was dissolving in fog. There was no anger in my voice, no accusation, just clarity. He looked up at me, eyes red but steady. "So that's it? There's nothing I can say?" I felt the ache then, the grief of finality. "This isn't punishment," I said gently. "I'm not trying to teach you a lesson. I just can't go back to asking to be seen." Silence again. But this silence wasn't defensive. It was acceptance beginning to form. He nodded slowly, as if absorbing a language he had never fully learned. "I thought loving you meant providing," he said. "I didn't realize you needed more presence." "I needed partnership in my inner world," I replied. He closed his eyes briefly. "I wish I had understood that sooner." "So do I." There was no satisfaction in that exchange. No triumph. No feeling of dominance. Just two adults sitting with the consequences of different emotional capacities. He didn't beg. I didn't belittle. We spoke about logistics calmly, about the children, about living arrangements, about maintaining respect. At one point, he said, "You're very calm about this." I gave a small, almost sad smile. "I've had a long time to process." That was the truth he hadn't witnessed. The confrontation wasn't heated because the fire had already burned out inside me months ago. What remained wasn't anger, it was completion. And sometimes, completion is the quietest ending of all. It has been a year. Not a cinematic year. Not the kind that fits into a montage of glow ups and triumphant music. Just a steady, human year. Paperwork signed, furniture rearranged, new routines formed around the children's schedules. Quiet evenings that felt unfamiliar at first, then slowly honest. I still live in the same city, the same grocery store, the same early morning light is coming through the kitchen window. But I'm not the same woman standing in that light. The first few months after the divorce were layered in ways I didn't anticipate. Grief didn't arrive as regret, it arrived as memory. A song we used to like, a photo from years ago when survival still felt romantic. The sound of his laugh drifted down the hallway during exchanges with the kids. I allowed myself to feel all of it. Because leaving with clarity doesn't mean leaving without love. I grieved the version of us that once tried. The nights in hospital rooms, the whispered plans when money was tight, the shared determination. That history mattered. It still does. But here's the difference. I grieved the marriage. I did not regret my decision. That distinction became my anchor. Something subtle began changing in my body before I could articulate it. The constant low grade vigilance I had normalized for years, monitoring tone, managing emotional temperature, anticipating needs, began to fade. My shoulders rested lower. My breath deepened. My autoimmune flare ups became less frequent, not cured, not magically resolved, just less braced. I hadn't realized how much energy it took to quietly negotiate for emotional presence. Without that negotiation, there was space. I expanded my bookkeeping practice gradually, not in desperation, but in ownership. Clients sought me out for my steadiness, my clarity, my attention to detail. For the first time, those traits felt like assets, not roles assigned to keep peace, but skills chosen with intention. The leather bound planner that once held medication schedules and family logistics now holds personal milestones, fitness goals, travel ideas, professional development plans, reflections after therapy sessions. It holds me. Daniel and I co parent respectfully. There is no war between us. If anything, there is a sober maturity that didn't exist before. We speak directly now. Logistics are clean, boundaries are clear. He once told me, months after everything settled, I'm starting to understand what you meant. I believed him, but understanding after departure is different from understanding in time. And I no longer measure my life by whether someone else finally sees what I try to show them. Who I am now is not hardened. That's something I'm proud of. I didn't let disappointment turn into bitterness. I didn't let loneliness turn into cynicism. I didn't let misalignment convince me that intimacy is impossible. If anything, I'm more precise about intimacy now. I know the difference between being admired for resilience and being comforted in vulnerability. I know the difference between partnership in crisis and partnership in emotion. I know the difference between someone relying on me and someone truly knowing me. And perhaps most importantly, I know what it feels like to abandon myself slowly, so I no longer do it. People still describe me as calm, reliable, strong, but those words no longer feel like a cage I must live inside, because now my strength includes softness. It includes asking directly. It includes walking away when necessary. It includes honoring the quiet signal in my chest before it turns into a silent erosion. I'm not the woman who can endure anything. I am the woman who chooses what she will endure. And the most surprising truth of all, I feel more visible alone than I ever did while being dependent on. Not because someone else finally learned how to see me, but because I stopped disappearing. If you've listened this far, you might be expecting a dramatic moral, a villain exposed, a hero vindicated, a lesson wrapped neatly in right and wrong. But this story doesn't divide that cleanly. Daniel wasn't cruel. I wasn't perfect. There was no betrayal. There was simply a slow, almost invisible misalignment between what I needed emotionally and what he understood love to be. Our marriage survived illness. It survived debt. It survived loss. But it did not survive emotional neglect. And neglect doesn't always look like indifference. Sometimes it looks like competence without curiosity, stability without softness, admiration without attunement. The hardest battles weren't visible. They happened in quiet kitchens, in late night thoughts, in sentences that sounded small but carried weight. I feel lonely, and in responses that weren't cruel but weren't deep enough. If there's a lesson here, it's not leave at the first sign of distance. It's this: don't ignore the quiet erosion of your inner world just because the outside looks stable. You can love someone and still be misaligned. You can appreciate someone and still need more. You can survive together and still feel alone. And strength is not how much you can endure before collapsing. Strength is noticing when endurance has replaced intimacy and choosing alignment over inertia. I didn't leave to punish him. I left because I had already punished myself long enough by minimizing what I needed. If you're in a relationship that looks fine on paper but feels thin in your chest, I'm not here to tell you what to do. I'm here to ask you something gentler. Are you being emotionally seen or just emotionally relied on? I'd love to hear your experience in the comments.
Video hữu ích, hãy ấn like và đăng ký kênh để ủng hộ mình nhé. Chúng ta sẽ gặp nhau ở những video tiếp theo. Bye bye.